Hey everyone, and welcome. Today we're diving into a group that defines itself not really by a brand name, but by a powerful idea of ownership, the Church of Christ. And we're going to use the work of Andrew B. Mumbor as our guide to build a definition from the ground up so we can really understand what that means.
So, let's start with the big question. What is the Church of Christ? It seems like a straightforward question, right? But the answer is actually woven through a ton of history, belief, and some very specific practices. Andrew B. Mumbor's work really aims to cut through any confusion and just give us a clear, solid answer. And this quote, this really gets right to the heart of it. For Mumbor, and this isn't just some academic debate, he's basically saying that without a clear definition, a group's entire identity can just get lost. So the whole purpose here is to solve that problem and establish a really solid foundational understanding.
All right, so to build that definition, we've got to start at the beginning. Let's look at the name itself and where this whole thing comes from. After all, if you want to know what something is today, you have to understand its roots.
Okay, so the first thing you really need to get is the name. The name Church of Christ isn't meant to be a denominational label, like a brand. Instead, it's framed as a simple description of ownership. It's the church that belongs to Christ. This concept is absolutely fundamental to its identity.
So where did this all come from? Well, it traces back to something called the Restoration Movement in the early 1800s. The central plea, the whole big idea, was for Christians to unify by going all the way back to the practices of the New Testament. This intense focus on the Bible alone is what eventually led to a formal split from other denominations around the early 1900s, because there were disagreements on those very practices.
Okay, so we have the name and the history. The next logical question is, what does that look like today? Let's dive into the tangible beliefs and actions that define the group. What do they actually do?
Well, that philosophy translates into these 5 key pillars. First up, the Bible is the only authority, no human-made creeds. Second, each local church is independent and self-governing. A really distinctive practice is a cappella worship, which just means singing without any instruments. And finally, they observe communion every single week and see baptism by immersion as essential for salvation.
And that last point about baptism? It's actually the final part of a very clear 5-step process that's often called the plan of salvation. It flows from hearing the gospel to believing, repenting, confessing your faith, and finally being baptized. The really crucial thing to get here is how belief and action are directly linked together in a required sequence. All right, so now we've got a pretty good handle on what the Church of Christ is and does. But to really get the full picture, it's just as important to understand what it is not. Sometimes, the best way to define something is to draw a clear line in the sand. And this is where those core differences really become obvious. On one side, you have authority coming only from the Bible, which leads to independent churches whose worship is modeled on the first century. On the other side, you see authority that also includes things like creeds and traditions, and that tends to result in more hierarchical structures and worship practices that have evolved over time. It's a really fundamental contrast in approach. This entire philosophy, this drive to get back to the original form of Christianity, is all captured in one key term: restorationism. Honestly, this is the engine behind everything we've been talking about. The core belief is that Christianity has kind of drifted from its origins, and the only solution is to restore the exact practices of the early church as described in the New Testament.
So, we've looked at the name, the history, the practices, and the key distinctions that set it apart. Now it's time to put all those pieces of the puzzle together into one single, cohesive definition.
So here it is. This is the unified definition we've been building toward. A non-denominational fellowship of autonomous congregations seeking to restore the beliefs and practices of the original New Testament church. See how every single word we've talked about is packed in there? Autonomous, the non-denominational stance, and that central mission to restore? It's a simple sentence, but it's incredibly powerful.
This whole explainer about how one group defines its identity, it kind of leaves us with a much broader question for ourselves, doesn't it? How much of our own identity is defined by what we call ourselves versus what we actually do? What really makes us who we are? It's a powerful thought to end on. Thanks for joining me for this explainer.